The night fell over the city like a dark shroud, drenched by the incessant rain that furiously battered the windows. Dela, a young woman with wavy brown hair and bright green eyes, woke up startled, remembering that she had forgotten to close the windows before going to bed. With an annoyed sigh, she got out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. As she struggled with the window latch, which seemed swollen from the humidity, a sound caught her attention. Male voices coming from the street, barely audible above the roar of the storm. Dela stood still, her heart pounding in her chest. "Let's kill this guy and get out of here before anyone sees us," said a rough, harsh voice. "Scorpion, don't stab him," responded another voice, deeper and more authoritative. "The boss said he must suffer. We've already drugged him, so let's tie him up and throw him into the ravine. The erosion will take care of the rest." Dela held her breath, her eyes widening in horror. Through the curtain of rain, she saw the silhouettes of two men dragging a third, inert figure from a black car parked on the street. The man who seemed to be in charge wore a black hood that concealed his face, while his shorter, stockier companion had a visible scorpion tattoo on his forearm. Without thinking twice, Dela moved away from the window and ran to her brother Iván's room. She shook him urgently, whispering frantically, "Iván, wake up. They're about to kill someone outside." Iván, a tall and athletic 25-year-old, woke up confused. "What? Dela, are you dreaming?" "No time to explain. We have to save that person," insisted Dela, pulling his arm. Still dazed but alarmed by the urgency in his sister's voice, Iván quickly got up. They both put on shoes and jackets over their pajamas and quietly left the house, careful not to wake their parents. The rain soaked them instantly as they ran towards the nearby ravine. Dela's heart pounded, a mix of fear and adrenaline coursing through her veins. Iván, now fully awake, scanned the surroundings for danger. They reached the edge of the ravine just in time to see the two men pushing the inert body off the cliff. Without thinking, Dela shouted, "Stop!" The men turned, surprised. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, the hooded man shouted, "Let's go!" and they both ran towards their car. Iván reacted quickly, memorizing the vehicle's license plate as it sped away. Dela, on the other hand, was already running to the edge of the ravine, desperate to find the victim. "There!" she exclaimed, pointing to a dark shape among the bushes and rocks a few meters below. "Iván, help me get down." Carefully but urgently, the siblings descended the slippery slope. They found a young man, around 20 years old, with dark hair soaked with rain and blood. He was unconscious, with his hands and feet tied. "He's alive," Iván confirmed after checking his pulse, "but he needs urgent medical help." Between the two of them, they managed to carry the injured man back to the street. Dela took out her mobile phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the emergency number. "We need an ambulance," she said, her voice shaking, to the operator. "We have an injured man, possible overdose and physical trauma." While waiting for the ambulance, Dela held the man's head in her lap, shielding him from the rain as best she could. Her eyes roamed over his bruised face, wondering who he was and why someone would want to hurt him. The minutes felt like an eternity until the ambulance finally arrived, its red lights illuminating the stormy night. The paramedics acted quickly, stabilizing the man and loading him into the ambulance. "Are any of you family?" asked one of the paramedics. Dela and Iván exchanged a look. "No," Dela replied, "but I'll go with him. He's a friend." Iván nodded, understanding. "I'll explain to Mom and Dad. I'll see you at the hospital." As the ambulance sped away, Dela held the stranger's hand, a strange sense of connection washing over her. She didn't know who this man was, but something inside her told her that their fates were irrevocably linked. At the hospital, the doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize the man. Dela waited in the emergency room, her clothes still wet, trembling as much from the cold as from anxiety. When Iván arrived, he brought dry clothes and a barrage of questions from their parents. "They're worried and angry," Iván explained. "They don't understand why we left in the middle of the night to help a stranger." Dela sighed, rubbing her tired eyes. "I couldn't just do nothing, Iván. They would have killed him." Before Iván could respond, a doctor approached them. His expression was grave. "Are you the ones who brought in the man from the ravine?" Both nodded, tensing at the doctor's tone. "It's been a difficult night," the doctor continued. "The patient is stable, but—" He paused, searching for the right words. "The drug he was given has caused damage to his brain. He will need specialized care and intensive therapy. Have you been able to contact his family?" Dela and Iván exchanged a worried look. "We don't know who he is," Dela admitted. "We found him like that." The doctor frowned. "I see. Well, for now, he's in an induced coma. We'll do everything we can for him, but you should know that his recovery, if he does recover, will be long and difficult." The doctor's words weighed on Dela like a stone. While Iván spoke with the doctor about medical and legal details, she approached the window of the room where the stranger lay. Connected to machines and tubes, he looked so vulnerable, so far from the man he surely had been before that fateful night. In that moment, Dela made a decision that would change the course of her life. "I will stay with him," she said softly but firmly. "Until he recovers, or until we find his family." Iván looked at her in surprise. "Dela, you can't. You have your life, your job, your boyfriend Bob." "This is more important," she interrupted. "I don't know why, but I feel I have to do this. Please, understand." Meanwhile, in another part of the city, a man named Dan paced nervously in his luxurious office. The phone in his hand trembled slightly as he listened to a report from one of his subordinates. "What do you mean he's not dead?" Dan growled, his face contorting with rage. "I gave you a simple task. Get rid of my dear brother Obie. How could you fail?" The voice on the other end stammered an explanation, but Dan was no longer listening. His mind was racing, calculating the risks and new possibilities this situation presented. Obie, his younger brother, was the legitimate heir to the vast family fortune and the business empire their father had built. Dan, the firstborn, had been disinherited years ago due to his shady dealings and reckless lifestyle. But with Obie out of the way, he could claim everything that, in his twisted mind, rightfully belonged to him. "Find him," Dan finally ordered. "And this time, make sure you finish the job. I don't care how, but Obie cannot survive." He hung up the phone and poured himself a glass of whiskey, his eyes fixed on the family portrait hanging on the wall. In it, a younger Obie smiled, unaware of the hatred his older brother harbored in his heart. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Dela split her time between the hospital and her work as a freelance graphic designer, which she was fortunately able to do from her laptop in Obie's room. Yes, now she knew his name. After the police published his photo, a nurse recognized him as Obie Blackwood, the youngest son of a wealthy family who had disappeared months ago. The revelation of his identity brought a flood of complications. Journalists camped outside the hospital, eager for the scoop on the missing heir. The Blackwood family, represented by impeccably dressed lawyers, demanded full control over Obie's care and, by extension, over Dela. But Dela stood firm. Something inside her, a voice she couldn't ignore, told her she had to protect Obie. Even when her boyfriend Bob begged her to leave this madness and return to her normal life, she refused. "I don't understand why you're throwing your life away for a stranger," Bob said one afternoon, his frustration evident in every word. "You have a bright future, Dela. Don't ruin it for this." Dela looked at Bob, the man with whom she had imagined a future, and felt a rift opening between them. "I'm not ruining anything, Bob. I'm following my heart. If you can't understand that, maybe—" She left the sentence hanging, the implications clear. Bob looked at her for a long moment, pain and disappointment in his eyes. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the hospital room. Dela knew, deep in her heart, that it was the last time she would see him. As the days passed, Dela immersed herself more and more in Obie's world. She read his favorite books aloud, told him about her day, and even learned to interpret the subtle changes in the monitors that indicated that, somehow, Obie was listening. It was during one of these reading sessions that Dela noticed something different. Obie's hand, which she held while reading, moved slightly. It was barely perceptible, but to Dela, it felt like the whole world had shifted. "Obie?" she whispered, leaning closer. "Can you hear me?" Obie's eyelids fluttered, and then slowly his eyes opened. They were a deep blue, like the ocean after a storm. For a moment he seemed disoriented, his eyes scanning the room until they finally settled on Dela. "Angel," he murmured, his voice hoarse from disuse. "You're real." Dela felt her heart flip. "I'm Dela," she said softly. "You've been asleep for a long time, Obie." Before she could say more, doctors and nurses flooded the room, alerted by the changes in the monitors. Dela was pushed aside as the medical team examined Obie, asking questions and running tests. In the following days, Obie's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. His mind, though initially confused, began to clear. He remembered fragments of his kidnapping, the fear, the drug they had given him. But what he remembered most, he insisted, were Dela's green eyes and her voice reading to him during his coma. As Obie regained his strength, Dela found herself falling deeper into a love she had never experienced before. It wasn't just gratitude or a connection born of extraordinary circumstances. It was something more, something that seemed predestined. However, the joy of his recovery soon was overshadowed by the reality of Obie's situation. The police wanted his testimony about the kidnapping, the doctors insisted on more tests and therapy, and the Blackwood family pressured to take him home. It was during one of these tense discussions with the family's lawyers that Obie finally erupted. "Enough!" he shouted, startling everyone in the room. "I won't go anywhere without Dela. She is the reason I'm alive, the reason I fought to wake up. If my family can't accept her, then they are no longer my family." The silence that followed his declaration was deafening. The lawyers exchanged uncomfortable glances while Dela felt her heart race. Obie looked at her, his blue eyes filled with unyielding determination. "Dela," he said softly, reaching out his hand to her, "will you stay with me? Not just here in the hospital, but in my life." Dela felt the world around her fade away. Only she and Obie existed in that moment. Without hesitation, she took his hand and nodded, the words caught in her throat by emotion. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. The news that the Blackwood heir had awakened and apparently found love during his coma spread like wildfire. The media went into a frenzy, paparazzi camped outside the hospital, and social media exploded with theories and rumors. Meanwhile, in the shadows, Dan seethed with rage. His plan had failed spectacularly, and now his brother was not only alive, but had become a media sensation. He knew he had to act quickly before Obie remembered too much and implicated him in the attempted murder. With the help of some unethical contacts in the hospital, Dan managed to gain access to Obie's room one night. He slipped inside, a syringe filled with a lethal substance hidden in his sleeve. But just as he was about to inject the poison into Obie's IV, the door opened. Dela entered, her eyes widening as she saw Dan leaning over Obie. "Who are you?" she exclaimed, instantly sensing something was wrong. Dan turned, panic visible in his eyes for a moment before a mask of calm slid over his face. "I'm Dan, Obie's older brother. I was just checking on him." But Dela didn't buy it for a second. Her instinct, the same one that had led her to save Obie that rainy night, screamed that this man was dangerous. Without a second thought, she pressed the emergency call button. What followed was chaos. Security guards rushed in, Dan tried to escape, and in the confusion, the syringe fell to the floor, breaking and revealing its lethal contents. Obie woke up, disoriented at first, but quickly understanding the situation as he saw his brother being subdued by the guards. "Dan," Obie murmured, betrayal evident in his voice. "Why?" Dan, knowing he was caught, began to laugh hysterically. "Why? Because you had it all. The love of our parents, the inheritance, the bright future. I was just the black sheep, the failure. But with you out of the way, everything would be mine." Obie looked at his brother with a mix of horror and pity. "Dan, I never wanted to take anything from you. I always admired you, always wanted your approval." But Dan was no longer listening. As the guards handcuffed him and led him out of the room, he continued shouting threats and curses. Dela approached Obie, taking his hand and offering silent comfort. In the following days, the truth came to light. Dan was arrested and charged with attempted murder. The investigation revealed a network of corruption and crime that extended far beyond the attempt on Obie's life. Illegal businesses, bribes, and even connections to organized crime came to the surface. For Obie, it was as if the world he knew had crumbled. The image of his perfect family shattered, and he found himself questioning everything he had ever believed. Amid this emotional whirlwind, Dela remained his rock, his constant. One afternoon, as Obie looked out the hospital window, lost in thought, Dela approached and handed him a cup of tea. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. Obie sighed, turning to look at her. "About how everything has changed, how I've changed. Dela, before all this, I was different. I lived in a bubble of privilege, oblivious to the real world. Now, after being so close to death, after seeing the darkness in my own family, I don't know who I am anymore." Dela took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "You are Obie, the man who fought to live, the man with a heart so big that even after all that's happened, feels compassion for his brother. You are the man I fell in love with, not for your last name or your bank account, but for your soul." Obie looked at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "How can you see me like that, after everything that's happened, after turning your life upside down?" "Obie," Dela interrupted, her voice firm but filled with love, "you didn't turn my life upside down. You gave it meaning. Before you, I lived a normal, safe, predictable life. But from the moment I saw you that rainy night, I knew my destiny had changed, and I wouldn't trade a second of what we've been through together." In that moment, as if the universe wanted to underscore Dela's words, a ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the room. Obie looked at Dela, seeing in her green eyes a future he had never dared to imagine. "I love you," he said simply, the words loaded with promise and gratitude. "And I love you," Dela replied, leaning in to kiss him softly. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Obie was discharged from the hospital, but instead of returning to the Blackwood mansion, he decided to move in with Dela in her small apartment. The press had a field day with this news, speculating about the prince renouncing his castle for love. But for Obie and Dela, it was simply the beginning of their new life together. Obie dedicated himself to learning about the real world, working on charity projects, and using his influence and resources to make a positive difference. Dela continued her graphic design work, inspired by the new experiences and emotions she lived every day. However, not everything was rosy. Dela began experiencing dizziness and nausea, which she initially attributed to the stress of the past few months. But when the symptoms persisted, she decided to visit a doctor. The news hit her like a lightning bolt. She was pregnant. With trembling hands, Dela left the clinic, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. How would Obie react? They were just starting their life together. Were they ready to be parents? And more importantly, how could she protect this baby from the dangerous world they had experienced? That night, when Obie came home, he found Dela sitting on the couch, lost in thought. "Is something wrong, love?" he asked, sitting next to her and taking her hand. Dela told him about her encounter with Bob and the doubts he had sown. As she spoke, she saw how Obie's face went from worry to understanding, and finally to quiet determination. "Dela," he said softly when she finished speaking, "I understand that you're afraid. I am too. Our story hasn't been conventional, and the future is always uncertain. But there's one thing I'm completely sure of. I love you. I love our baby. And I will do everything in my power to protect and make you both happy." Dela felt tears filling her eyes. "Oh, Obie," she whispered, "I love you too. And today, when I felt the baby move for the first time, I knew everything would be okay." Obie's eyes lit up with excitement. "You felt it move? Can I?" he asked, reaching out his hand to her belly. She nodded, guiding his hand to the spot where she had felt the movement. For several minutes they sat in silence, waiting. And then, as if the baby wanted to reaffirm its presence, there was another slight movement. The The smile that lit up Obie's face was something Dela would never forget. It was a mix of wonder, love, and a joy so pure it made her heart swell with happiness. "It's real," Obie murmured, his voice filled with emotion. "We're a family." In that moment, all the doubts and fears that Bob had tried to sow completely vanished. Dela knew, with unshakable certainty, that this was her destiny. She, Obie, and their unborn baby would face any challenge life threw at them, together. The following months passed in a whirlwind of preparations and anticipation. Obie immersed himself in books on parenting and child development, determined to be the best father possible. Dela, for her part, found a new passion in designing baby clothes and accessories, channeling her creativity into preparing the nest for their little one. However, the shadow of the past still loomed on the edges of their happiness. Dan, Obie's brother, was in prison awaiting trial, but his connections in the criminal world remained active. Occasionally, Obie received veiled threats, reminders that not everyone was happy with how things had turned out. One night, while Dela was sleeping, Obie received a call that chilled his blood. A distorted voice warned him that if he testified against Dan at the upcoming trial, both Dela and the baby would be in danger. Obie spent the night awake, torn between his desire for justice and his need to protect his family. When dawn arrived, he made a decision. He couldn't put Dela and the baby at risk, but he also couldn't allow Dan and his accomplices to go unpunished. With a heavy heart, Obie gently woke Dela. "Love," he said softly, "we need to talk." Dela sat up, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "What's wrong, Obie? Is everything okay?" Obie took a deep breath and told her about the threat. He saw the fear reflected in Dela's eyes, but he also saw the strength and determination he loved so much in her. "What are we going to do?" Dela asked, her hand instinctively protecting her swollen belly. "I have an idea," Obie replied, "but it won't be easy. We'll have to leave everything behind for a while." And so, in the span of a few days, Obie and Dela disappeared. To the outside world, it seemed they had vanished into thin air. Tabloids speculated wildly, some suggesting they had fled together to a tropical island, others hinting at trouble in paradise. The reality was very different. With the help of trusted contacts, Obie had organized an elaborate plan. He and Dela moved to a small coastal town under false identities. They lived in a modest house, far from the luxuries Obie was used to, but filled with the love and hope they shared. Meanwhile, in the city, the trial against Dan proceeded. Although Obie was not physically present, he had left detailed testimony and irrefutable evidence in the hands of the prosecutors. Dan and his accomplices were found guilty of multiple charges, ensuring they would spend decades behind bars. In their new home, Dela gave birth to a beautiful baby girl they named Hope. With her blue eyes like Obie's and Dela's brown hair, she was the perfect combination of both. Months after Hope's birth, when they were sure the danger had passed, Obie and Dela decided it was time to return. But they were no longer the same people who had left. Their time in anonymity had taught them the value of simplicity and the importance of family above all else. When they returned to the city, it was on their own terms. Obie used his fortune and influence to establish a foundation dedicated to helping victims of violent crimes and their families. Dela, inspired by her experience, launched a line of clothing for mothers and babies, with part of the proceeds going to shelters for women in vulnerable situations. And so, what had begun as a stormy night and a desperate rescue had transformed into a story of love, overcoming, and hope. Obie and Dela, with little hope in their arms, had not only found each other, but also their purpose in life. As they watched their daughter take her first steps in the garden of their new home, a house that combined the security they needed with the simplicity they had learned to love, Obie and Dela exchanged a look full of love and gratitude. "Who would have thought," murmured Obie, "that rainy night would change our lives forever?" Dela smiled, intertwining her fingers with his. "Destiny," she simply replied, "and I'm grateful for every moment, even the difficult ones, because they brought us here." Hope let out a giggle, drawing her parents' attention as she tried to catch a butterfly fluttering nearby. In that instant, perfect in its simplicity, Obie and Dela knew they wouldn't change a thing about their journey. Every challenge, every obstacle had led them to this moment of pure happiness.